I learned the truth about my daughter on a Tuesday night at 9:14 p.m. when my phone buzzed with a message I wasn't meant to see. When will that old hag finally die? I'm so tired of tiptoeing around her. I read it once, then again, and with every word, something in me didn't break. It stilled as if someone had quietly closed a heavy door inside my chest. For a long moment, I just sat there in my armchair, my hands resting on the wool blanket across my knees. At 80, my fingers are thinner, but they still know how to hold on to the edges of truth without trembling. And the truth was simple. My daughter, my only child, had finally said out loud what she'd been thinking for years. Only she hadn't meant to send it to me. No, that message was for her husband Gavin. A private little sigh of irritation about the woman who fed them, housed them, and pretended not to notice the way their eyes hardened whenever I walked into a room. I didn't cry. At my age, tears rarely come for fresh wounds. They come for old ones that were never tended. Instead, I folded the phone closed as if tucking a letter back into its envelope, and listened to the quiet house settling around me. This home has always been gentle with me. Its wooden beams remember my laughter from years when my husband Thomas still walked its halls. Perhaps that is why the message felt less like betrayal and more like confirmation of something I had already begun to sense, like a draft sneaking in through a door left ajar. Down the hall, I could hear the muffled sound of my daughter loading the dishwasher. I imagined her expression tight, impatient, as if kindness cost her more than she could afford. They thought I was asleep. They often thought that old age to them meant absence. Silence, a soft piece of furniture placed in the corner and occasionally dusted with obligatory politeness. I sat for a long time. Long enough for the kitchen lights to click off, long enough for footsteps to pass my door without pausing. They didn't check on me. They rarely did unless they needed something. My signature, my pension statement, the reassurance that the house was still in my name and not theirs. The message glowed in my mind the way truth sometimes does, cold bright, strangely clean. When I finally rose from my chair, my joints protested, but not enough to stop me. I moved slowly through the house, letting my hand graze the familiar textures. The oak banister Thomas polished every spring, the hallway wall where we once marked our daughter's height with a pencil. She was 6 when she reached the brass door knob, 10 when she surpassed it, 24 when she stopped reaching for me altogether. In the kitchen, the faint scent of lemon detergent lingered. I poured myself a glass of water, each movement deliberate. I was not planning anything yet. I simply needed the steadiness that comes when you acknowledge reality without flinching. I carried the water to the window. Outside the porch, light cast a wide circle on the empty lawn. Years ago, that light meant safety. Thomas returning from late shifts, our daughter racing up the steps after school. Tonight. It only illuminated how small my world had become, how much of my life I had handed away, because I believed love was something you kept proving. I sat at the table and set the phone in front of me. I didn't open the message again. I didn't need to. Instead, I folded my hands and let the weight of 80 years settle in my bones. Years of giving, smoothing, forgiving, stepping aside. I whispered into the quiet. So that's how you see me. No bitterness, no anger, only a steady, cooling clarity. Morning would come, and with it, decisions I had avoided for far too long. Tonight I allowed myself only the truth, and the truth was enough. People like to believe arrangement happens suddenly after one cruel sentence or one unforgivable act. But in my life, distance arrived quietly, like mold creeping along a basement wall, slow, unnoticed, and already rooted by the time you finally see it. When my husband Thomas died 11 years ago, my daughter Ellen was the one who insisted I shouldn't live alone. "It's not safe for you, Mom," she'd said, squeezing my hand with a gentleness that already felt slightly rehearsed. Gavin stood behind her, nodding as if he'd been briefed. I remember thinking how grateful I was to have a family willing to fold me into their home. But of course they weren't folding me into theirs. They were moving into mine. The house had always been too big for just me. 4 bedrooms, wide hallways, a garden. Thomas tended until his breath gave out at 59. When I suggested selling it, Ellen's reaction was instant sharp. Why would you sell something so valuable? It's our family home, she said, or the way a person might claim a coat they'd never worn but suddenly wanted. I told myself she was grieving. We all were. So I accepted her idea. She and Gavin would move in temporarily just until they saved enough for a down payment on their own place. They brought boxes too many for something temporary and filled the rooms with their belongings, while mine slowly retreated to corners, to drawers, to storage. It wasn't malicious. It was simply happening. Gavin was polite at first, overly polite, calling me Mrs. Hall as if age had erased motherhood and left only formality behind, but politeness curdled over time into a cool tolerance. He avoided sitting where I sat, avoided lingering in the same room, avoided conversation, unless it was about bills, repairs, or taxes. I became gradually and without announcement a responsibility rather than a person. Ellen changed more softly, but in ways that stung deeper. She stopped laughing with me, stopped asking about my day, began sighing when I entered a room mid-con conversation, as if my presence shifted the air in a way she found inconvenient. She was 52, but carried herself like someone who believed old age was contagious. The first time I noticed the change, she was on the phone with a friend. I heard her say, "It's like living with a shadow." She doesn't need much, but she's always there. She didn't know I was passing the door. Or perhaps she did. I remember standing in the hallway afterward, touching my own arm as if to confirm I was still solid. Before Thomas died, Ellen and I used to talk about everything. Recipes, neighbors, the new minister's terrible haircut. She once told me she hoped to inherit my patience someday. It seems she inherited only my silence. Little things accumulated. They always do. Ellen stopped inviting me to their dinners out, saying restaurants were too loud for you. Gavin complained that I left lights on, though I hadn't. They began whispering in the evenings, lowering their voices, not out of courtesy, but secrecy. I learned to walk softly, to ask for less, to shrink around the edges of their life. But the house bore witness to all of it. It felt smaller, though nothing in its structure had changed. Doors were shut that once remained open. I had meals alone more often than not. And whenever Ellen's friends visited, she introduced me as Mom. She's staying with us for now, staying as though I were someone's guest in the home my husband built with his hands. Still, I told myself it was normal. Families drift, then return. People say foolish things they don't fully mean. Gavin had a stressful job. Ellen worried too much. I excused them the way mothers do, smoothing their sharp corners before they cut me. Then came the conversations about money. Subtle at first. Ellen asking whether I really needed the larger bedroom, suggesting they remodel parts of the house to increase resale value someday. Someday. Not my someday, theirs. And when I didn't react, she began leaving brochures on the kitchen table about estate planning for seniors, highlighted passages about transferring property early to reduce inheritance tax. I recognized the tactic. Make me believe it was helpful, responsible, sensible. People forget that at 80 you've seen every strategy before. The truth is, I would have given them anything if they had simply been kind. It wasn't the message that night that ended something inside me. It only revealed what had been ending for years. The distance hadn't begun at 9:14 p.m. It had begun the moment they stopped seeing me as a mother and started seeing me as an obstacle. And that, I think, was the real grief. There are mornings when memory comes not as a story, but as a weight, warm, steady, unmistakably alive. That's how Thomas returns to me now. Not as a ghost, not as a dream, but as the quiet pressure of a hand on my shoulder when the world threatens to tip sideways. I felt him that night after the message, not in any mystical way, but in the simple steadiness that spread through me once the shock settled, as if he were reminding me who I once was. Thomas was a practical man, not given to speeches. He believed in doing a thing properly or not doing it at all. He built half the shelves in this house, patched the roof 3 times, and never once allowed the garden to go wild. When he died, the tomatoes still ripened in neat rows, as if refusing to accept their caretaker was gone. The house became my anchor then, and perhaps that is why I let Ellen and Gavin stay so easily. It felt like a continuation of the life Thomas and I had created. I thought having them here would fill the space he left behind, but grief can't be filled. It can only be carried, and I learned to carry it quietly, the way women of my generation were taught to handle their heaviest burdens. Back when Ellen was little, she adored her father. She followed him everywhere: the shed, the garage, the garden, asking questions, tugging his sleeve, demanding explanations for everything from engine oil to marolds. He had a patience with her I envied. With me, he was calm. With her, he was soft. I remember thinking that softness would protect her all her life. It didn't. Or perhaps it spoiled her. I'm not sure anymore. When she grew older, she drifted from him the way daughters often do. But she always returned to me. I was the one she told secrets to. I was the one she called crying when her first engagement fell apart. I was the one who sat with her during her miscarriages, holding her hand through the long silence afterward. There was a time when she looked at me with trust, not suspicion. A time when she loved me without calculation. But Thomas's death changed her more than I realized then. She became brittle sharp where she used to be tender. She began to resent anything that reminded her of vulnerability, even in herself, maybe, especially in herself. And I, unfortunately, was the greatest reminder of all. In the months after the funeral, she walked through this house as though it belonged to sorrow alone, not to memory. She spoke loudly, moved furniture, reorganized rooms, small rebellions against grief, I suppose. I said nothing because I understood that people mourn in odd, sometimes selfish ways. Still, I kept certain things untouched. Thomas's workbench, his favorite armchair, the framed photo of him on the porch steps, holding Ellen as a toddler. These small relics held the shape of who we were. I didn't cling to them out of desperation. I clung to them because they steadied me. But Ellen told me once lightly and with a smile too tight at the edges, "Mom, you really should start letting go. It's unhealthy to live in the past. Unhealthy as though memory were a disease." That was the first time I felt a small shift, a quick, almost imperceptible pull inside me, the kind a mother ignores because she wants to keep believing her child means well. Time continued its quiet work. Ellen's attention grew thinner. Gavin's presence felt heavier, and I, without meaning to, began stepping around their moods the way I once stepped around Thomas's tools scattered in the garage. I used to sit on the back porch in the evenings watching the sun dip behind the maple trees. Thomas and I would drink tea there. He always said the view was better at dusk because it softened the edges of everything. I held on to those evenings long after he was gone. But eventually Ellen began using the porch for her phone calls, pacing back and forth, lighting candles that smelled of eucalyptus and something chemical. The space became hers in a way that pushed me out without any discussion at all. One night, years before the text message, I overheard her telling someone, "I can't keep living like this. It's like being trapped. She's always here." She didn't say my name. She didn't need to. I remember going to bed early that evening, not out of hurt, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of quietly forgiving what hasn't even been acknowledged. Earlier in my life, when I felt uncertain, I would ask Thomas, "What should we do?" And he would always answer the same way. "We'll think it through in the morning." Morning was his time for decisions. He believed clarity belonged to daylight. After reading Ellen's message that night, those words returned to me with remarkable calmness. Think it through in the morning. And I did. Not emotionally, not angrily, just truthfully. Because the woman Ellen wanted, gone the old hag, was still the same woman Thomas once loved, deeply, steadily, without hesitation. And I owed that woman far more than silence. Morning has a way of exposing everything you tried to soften the night before. At 80, I wake early out of habit, not need, and that day was no different. The house was still dark, the kind of deep, bluish quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. I sat up slowly, letting my joints catch up with the idea of movement. The message from the night before hadn't vanished with sleep. It waited for me sharp and unchanged, like a stone on the kitchen table. I didn't reread it. I didn't need to. Instead, I folded the blanket at the foot of the bed, smoothed the corners, and stood for a moment listening. Ellen and Gavin were still asleep. Their room was at the far end of the hallway, the very room Thomas and I once shared. I had moved into the smaller guest room years ago at Ellen's suggestion. "It makes more sense this way, Mom," and I complied without resistance. That morning, for the first time, I noticed the small allness of the space around me. Not the room itself, but the way I had fit myself into a version of living that required me to stay out of the way. I dressed quietly, choosing a cardigan. Thomas always liked the soft gray one with the thinning elbows. The house felt colder than usual. Maybe that was simply the clarity settling in. When I opened my bedroom door, the hallway greeted me with that familiar smell of wood polish and old photographs. So much life had occurred here, and so much had been tolerated. In the kitchen, I boiled water for tea. The kettle took its time humming as though considering its own place in the world. I sat at the table and waited, hands folded in my lap. I wasn't angry. I was deliberate. It's a different kind of strength, calmer and steadier than rage. Rage bursts. Clarity holds. By the time I finished my tea, I knew what I needed to do. Not to teach anyone a lesson, not to make them suffer. No, I simply needed to step out of a life that had been shrinking around me for years, and I needed to do it fully with the same quiet certainty that Thomas had once brought to every decision he made. I took the folder of documents from the drawer where I kept everything important. House deed insurance papers, the old will that needed rewriting the power of attorney Ellen had insisted on just for emergencies. I placed them neatly into my tote bag. They felt heavier than paper should feel. Or maybe it was the weight of everything they represented. I slipped on my coat and shoes. My keys, my original set, were still on the hook by the door. Ellen and Gavin had copies made years ago. They never asked. They simply did it, and I pretended not to notice. The sun was just beginning to rise when I stepped outside. The porch boards creaked beneath my feet, familiar and loyal. They have always groaned for me and only for me. I paused there for a moment, breathing in the cold morning air. It tasted of winter and something else, something like freedom. My car, an old blue sedan I kept despite Gavin's teasing, waited patiently in the driveway. "Why drive that relic?" he used to say. It's embarrassing, but it had never failed me, not once. And that morning, it started on the first turn of the key, as if it understood the urgency of my leaving. The streets were empty. A few porch lights flickered in the distant homes, stirring the way mine used to. I drove without thinking, the route etched as deeply as muscle memory. 2 blocks down left at the church, right at the bakery, then straight toward the small law office, where Thomas and I once sat together, signing our first mortgage. The parking lot was still empty when I arrived. I sat there for a while, hands resting on the steering wheel. This too felt like a kind of mourning, not for Ellen, but for the version of myself who had clung to hope long after it had dissolved. At 9 sharp, the office lights flicked on. I gathered my documents and walked toward the entrance. My legs were slow but steady. My reflection in the glass door startled me for a moment, not because of the wrinkles or the gray hair I've long made peace with my age, but because I finally looked like someone who remembered her own worth. Inside, the receptionist greeted me kindly. "Mrs. Holt, good morning. Do you have an appointment?" "I don't," I said, "but I believe it's time I make some changes." She nodded and led me to the waiting room. I sat down holding the tote bag close. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't hopeful. I was simply ready. For the first time in years, I felt like the house I lived in, solid-rooted and mine again. And morning, as Thomas always promised, had brought the clarity I needed. The law office hadn't changed much since the days Thomas and I first sat here signing loan papers. The same framed certificates on the wall, the same heavy wooden chair that always creaked when you leaned back too far. Even the scent paper carpet cleaner and old coffee felt exactly as it had 20 years ago. It grounded me. This was the place where real decisions were made, the kind you couldn't later hide behind excuses or sentiment. When the door opened and Mr. Dalton stepped out, I felt a small wave of relief. He'd handled our affairs for decades back when my hair was still brown and Thomas still argued with him good-naturedly about interest rates. Now Dalton looked softer around the middle with deeper lines around his eyes, but he still carried himself like a man who respected clarity. "Mary Ann," he said warmly, taking my hand between his. "It's been too long. Come in." I followed him into his office, the door clicking shut behind us. He waited for me to sit before lowering himself into his chair. "How can I help you today?" I placed my tote bag on my lap and drew out the stack of documents, smoothing the edges with deliberate care. "I need to make several changes," I said, "to my will, to my power of attorney, and to the title of my home." His brows lifted slightly, but not in judgment, only in recognition that something serious stood behind my words. "All right," he said, leaning forward. "Let's take them one at a time." I appreciated that about him. No fuss, no emotional probing, just steps laid out cleanly. "The power of attorney first," I said. "I'd like the existing one revoked immediately." He nodded, opening a file on his computer. "The current power of attorney names, your daughter, correct. Yes. And she will no longer hold that authority." He didn't ask why. He simply typed. I found myself grateful for that restraint. Explanations would have required me to speak Ellen's name aloud in a way I wasn't ready for. Not in this room. Not yet. Then came the house title. When I handed him the deed, he examined the paperwork with a slow, practiced patience. "The property is solely in your name, as it should be," he said. "What would you like to adjust? I want it protected," I replied. "Legally protected so that no one can make decisions about it except me. Not my daughter, not her husband, not anyone acting on their behalf." He nodded again. "There are several ways to do that. Revocable trust life estate transfer with retained control." "No," I interrupted gently. "I don't want them to have expectations. I don't want there to be any misunderstanding about ownership." His eyes softened. "Then a fully protected trust in your name alone would accomplish that. You would remain the sole beneficiary during your lifetime. And after," I asked quietly. "That depends on whom you choose." I thought for a moment. Not Ellen, not Gavin. Their absence settled into the room like dust. "My granddaughter," I said finally. "Nora. She's the only one I trust to remember who I actually am." He began drafting the preliminary documents. I watched him type each keystroke, sealing away pieces of the life I had lived for the last decade. My voice remained steady, but inside something loosened. Some invisible knot pulled tight for years. Next came the will. He asked his questions gently, guiding me through each line, ensuring I understood every implication. I did. I understood more clearly than I had in years. "Are you certain about these changes?" he asked. Once, only once, and with genuine concern rather than pressure. "I'm 80, Robert," I said softly. "See, certainty is one of the few things I have left, and today I'm using it." He smiled, a small, respectful tilt of the lips. Then he printed the documents for my review. I read every word. I initialed where required. I signed with a hand that did not tremble. When the last page was complete, he gathered the papers neatly. "Everything takes effect the moment these are filed," he said, "and I'll file them today." I nodded. "Thank you." He hesitated before speaking again. "If you ever need support beyond legal matters, you can call me. Losing trust in family is a particular kind of grief." I met his eyes. "I'm not grieving, Robert. I'm adjusting." When I stepped outside, the air felt different, crisp, almost unfamiliar. I stood for a moment, letting the winter sun warm my face. The documents in my bag no longer felt heavy. They felt earned. For the first time in years, I wasn't protecting anyone else's comfort. I was protecting my own life. And that quiet, deliberate choice was more powerful than anything Ellen could ever have written. By the time I returned home from the law office, the sun had climbed high enough to wash the house in a pale, indifferent light. It looked exactly as it had when I left that morning, quiet, still unchanged. But I was not the same woman who had walked out the door at dawn, holding a lifetime of hesitation in her chest. I parked the car, gathered my bag, and stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under my feet, their familiar complaint greeting me like an old friend. Inside the house was silent, but not the peaceful kind of silence Thomas used to enjoy. This was the expectant quiet of people just waking their needs and demands, stretching awake beside them. From the hallway, I heard footsteps. Ellen's quick, impatient rhythm. She emerged from the kitchen holding a mug, hair unbrushed, wrapped in the navy robe I had given her years ago. She looked surprised to see me fully dressed, my coat still on. "Mom, you're up early," she said. There was no concern in her voice, only mild irritation, as though my existence had disrupted her morning arrangement of thoughts. "I had things to do," I answered calmly. She frowned a little. "Things? What things?" "You didn't leave a note." The irony of that, after years of being treated like background noise, almost made me smile. "I didn't realize I needed to," I said. She shrugged, dismissing the comment rather than absorbing it. "Well, Gavin said he heard the front door. You woke him up." Gavin appeared, then blur-eyed, adjusting his glasses. "Mary Ann," he muttered with that clipped politeness he reserved for strangers and bank tellers. "Everything all right?" "Yes," I said simply. Everything is exactly as it should be. Neither of them heard the truth in my tone. They rarely listened for meaning, only for inconvenience. Ellen moved toward the dining table, already shifting into the day's irritation. "I swear, Mom, sometimes you make things so complicated. If you're going somewhere, just tell us. We can't be guessing what you're doing at your age." I watched her speak, her tight mouth, her restless hands, and felt the quietest separation settle between us like a curtain dropping. She had no idea how little right she had anymore to dictate anything about my life. "I managed just fine," I said. She opened her mouth to argue, but the kettle whistled on the stove, pulling her away. She turned, muttering something about responsibility. Gavin yawned loudly, checked his phone, and disappeared toward the bathroom. They moved through the house with the confidence of people who believed everything in it. Space, airtime, even me belonged to them. They didn't notice my tote bag beside the door. They didn't sense the shift in the air. They didn't recognize that something foundational had already been removed from under their feet. I walked to the living room and sat in Thomas's old chair. It welcomed me the same way it always had, with a small sigh in the cushions and a gentle settling against my back. From here, I could see the garden. The soil looked dark, ready for spring planting. Thomas would have been planting the tomatoes by now. Ellen returned with her tea and hovered in the doorway. "Mom, did you pay the electric bill? I saw something about an update coming through your email." I folded my hands. "The bills are no longer your concern." She blinked. "What does that mean?" Before I could answer, Gavin called from down the hall. "Ellen, did you change the Wi-Fi password? It's not working." She groaned. "Mom, did you press something on the router again?" "I didn't touch the router," I said gently. But I had touched something far more central to their comfort, their access, their assumptions, their certainty that I would always be here. Quiet, pliable, willing. For the first time, I saw confusion flicker in Ellen's eyes. A small, sharp confusion like a gust lifting the edges of a rug. She didn't yet understand what was coming, and I didn't feel the need to explain it before it arrived. I simply sat back in Thomas's chair, letting the room breathe around me, and allowed the truth to take its rightful place in the house. By midday, the house felt strangely hollow, as if the walls themselves sensed the shift that Ellen and Gavin still hadn't noticed. They moved around in their usual pattern, opening and closing cabinets, complaining about minor inconveniences, filling the air with the small, constant friction of dissatisfaction. And yet underneath all that noise, something had already begun to settle into place, firm and irreversible. I spent the morning in my room sorting through drawers, not because I intended to pack. No, that time hadn't arrived yet, but because the act of touching my own belongings reminded me that I still had a life separate from the two people who treated me like an obstacle. I found old letters from Thomas, a small box of Nora's childhood drawings, the silver brooch my mother gave me when I turned 30. Each item studied me. I heard Ellen on the phone in the kitchen. "No, I don't know why the Wi-Fi isn't working. Gavin thinks Mom messed with it again." She said it loudly enough that she wanted me to hear. I stepped into the hallway and spoke gently. I didn't touch anything. She waved a dismissive hand as if I were a gust of warm air. "Okay, Mom. Okay." I didn't correct her further. Explanations were wasted on people who weren't listening. Around 1:00, I called the locksmith. A polite young man answered and offered an appointment for the following morning. If possible, I said, I'd like everything done today. There must have been something in my tone. Age doesn't weaken intention. It only distills it. Because he agreed to rearrange his schedule. He arrived an hour later in a small white van, tools neatly arranged in the back. Ellen watched him through the front window, puzzled. Gavin came over and asked, "Marianne, what's this about? We don't need new locks." "No." I said, "I do." The young man approached with a clipboard. "You're Mrs. Holt?" "Yes." "And you want the front, back, and side doors rekeyed correct?" "That's right." Ellen stepped forward. "Wait, why, we already have perfectly good locks. They won't be your concern anymore," I replied calmly. Gavin looked at me sharply. "Are you implying we won't have access?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I addressed the locksmith. "Yes, please proceed." He nodded and went to gather his tools. Ellen's voice rose brittle around the edges. "Mom, what exactly are you doing? I'm securing my home." "But we live here," she protested. "For now," I said quietly, "until the legal notices arrive." I watched the words settle over them like dust. They didn't fully understand yet, but they felt the shift the way a person feels the first vibration before a train arrives. The locksmith worked quickly. Metal clicked hinges, shifted, keys turned with crisp finality. It wasn't the sound of conflict. It was the sound of boundaries, something Ellen and Gavin had never expected me to set. While he worked, I went to the study and typed out a brief message to my attorney confirming the lock changes and asking him to finalize the notice of termination of residency, because they were not tenants, they were guests without contract or rights, and the law, unlike family loyalty, does not bend for convenience. When I returned to the living room, Gavin was pacing. "This is overreacting," he muttered. "It has to be a misunderstanding." Ellen confronted me again, but her tone had shifted. Not anger now, but uncertainty. "Mom, if something's wrong, just talk to us." I looked at her for a long moment. She had Thomas's eyebrows, but none of his steadiness. "I did talk," I said quietly. "For years, you just didn't hear me." The locksmith handed me a small envelope with the new keys. I thanked him, paid him, and walked him to the door. When it closed behind him, the silence inside the house felt entirely different. Lighter, clearer, no longer shaped by their assumptions. Ellen stood with her arms crossed. Gavin stared at the floor. They both looked smaller than they had that morning. I placed the keys in my pocket. "There will be papers delivered soon," I said. "You'll have time to make arrangements for what Ellen whispered, to find a place where you are actually wanted." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply turned and walked down the hallway, feeling the floor steady beneath my feet in a way it hadn't in years. The first confrontation happened sooner than I expected. It began with a sharp rattle at the back door, followed by Gavin's raised voice drifting through the hall. I was in the living room sorting through a small stack of papers, old bank statements, mostly when his footsteps approached heavy and uneven. "Marianne?" he called, his tone clipped. "My key doesn't work." I didn't answer right away. I placed the papers in a neat pile and smoothed the surface of the table with my palm. Only then did I turn toward him. He stood in the doorway, breathing hard frustration simmering under his skin. Ellen hovered behind him, chewing the inside of her cheek the way she did when she felt things slipping beyond her control. "The locks have been changed," I said. He stared at me as though waiting for a punchline. "Yes, I gathered that." "Why?" "Because the house is mine," I replied, "and I'm securing it." "That doesn't make sense," Ellen snapped. "We live here." "For now," I said softly, but not for much longer. Ellen's eyes widened in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child, caught doing something she shouldn't. She took a step toward me. "Mom, what is all this? What's happening?" Their panic rolled through the room, thick and disorganized. I could almost feel it collecting in the corners. I remained seated, hands folded in my lap. "There will be official notices delivered within the week," I said. "Your residency is being terminated." Gavin laughed under his breath, a short, humorless sound. "Residency? Are you seriously talking to us like we're tenants?" "No," and I said. "Tenants have agreements." "You do not." Ellen's voice rose a little. "You invited us here." "I allowed you here," I corrected gently, "and that allowance has come to an end." Gavin stepped forward, anger tightening his jaw. "You can't just throw us out. We've lived here for years." "And not a single day," I replied. "Have you treated this home or me as something you valued?" They fell silent for a moment. In that pause, I saw something flicker across Ellen's face. Not remorse, but calculation. A frantic search for the right combination of words to regain control. "Mom," she finally said, softening her tone in a way I recognized far too well. "If this is about something we said, something we did, we can fix it. Let's just talk." She wanted reassurance, not truth. I took a measured breath. "I received a message last night," I said. "A message meant for Gavin." I watched the color drain from her face. Gavin looked at her sharply. "What message?" She didn't answer. I did. It said, "When will that old hag finally die?" The silence that followed was almost merciful in its honesty. Ellen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like a fish gasping in shallow water. Gavin looked away, jaw tight, staring at some fixed point on the wall. "Mom," Ellen whispered. I didn't mean I'm not interested in explanations," I said. "I'm interested in reality, and the reality is that you don't want me here." "That's not true," she insisted, stepping closer as if proximity alone could alter the shape of things. "It was a mistake, a stupid moment. I didn't mean it." "But you thought it?" I said quietly. She flinched. She knew it was true. Gavin crossed his arms. "Even if you're upset, this isn't proportional. Changing locks, legal notices, that's extreme." "No," I replied. "It's necessary." They looked so bewildered. Then two adults who'd built their lives on the assumption that I would always bend just enough to keep the peace. "You have time," I continued. "I'm not throwing you out today, but the process has begun." Ellen's voice broke on the edges. "Where are we supposed to go? It's your decision," I said. "You've made many decisions without including me. You can make this one too." For a brief moment, Ellen looked small, not in age or stature, but in understanding. She'd spent years directing every space she occupied. Now she was realizing this house had never been hers to direct. Gavin put a hand on her shoulder, as much to steady himself as her. "We'll figure it out," he muttered. I nodded once. "I'm sure you will." I rose from the chair slowly, my body old but my intention firm. I walked past them without touching them, without softening the truth. Behind me, I heard Ellen whisper. I didn't think she'd actually do anything. And Gavin's quiet reply. Maybe we never knew who we were dealing with. I didn't turn around. Their words weren't meant for me. I simply continued down the hallway, letting the weight of the moment settle where it belonged. Not on my shoulders anymore, but on theirs. The hours after our confrontation passed in a kind of muted tension, as if the house itself were waiting to see what Ellen and Gavin would do now that the ground beneath them had shifted. I stayed in the living room, sorting through a few old letters, letting their voices, friends long gone, neighbors moved away. Remind me of a time when conversations carried warmth instead of obligation. Ellen appeared in the doorway eventually. Her eyes were red, though I suspected more from frustration than sorrow. She lingered there, half in shadow, unsure how to enter a room that no longer belonged to her. "Mom," she said quietly, "can we please talk again?" I looked up. "We are talking." She took that as permission and stepped inside. Her movements were tentative now, cautious, as though the house might bruise her. She sat on the edge of the armchair across from me, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. "I know the message was awful," she began. "I know I hurt you, but you're overreacting. You can't just dismantle your whole life over one thing I said." It wasn't one thing I corrected gently. It was years of things. The message only removed the last curtain. She blinked hard, but throwing us out, ending everything. "You raised me, Mom. I'm your daughter. Being a mother is a tie of blood. Being treated like one is a tie of respect." I didn't say this aloud. Instead, I folded the letter in my hands and set it aside. "I'm not punishing you," I said. "I'm freeing myself. There's a difference." Her breath caught not from understanding, but disbelief. "Where will we go?" she asked again. "Do you want us to be homeless?" "You earn more than enough," I replied. "And Gavin does as well. You'll manage." "It's not that simple," she insisted. "It never is," I said. But simplicity was never the goal. Honesty is. Her composure cracked. Then she leaned forward, her voice trembling, not with tenderness, but with desperation. "Why are you doing this after everything I've done for you?" The word struck me with a strange, hollow gentleness. Done for me, as if tolerance were kindness, as if sharing my home while belittling my presence was a generosity. I met her eyes. "Tell me one thing you've done for me out of love, Ellen." She opened her mouth, closed it, looked away. "I've taken care of you," she said weakly. "That isn't true," I replied. "You've managed me. There's a difference." Her shoulders sagged. She looked older for the first time. Older not in years, but in the weight of realizing a version of herself no longer held power. "I didn't mean what I wrote," she whispered. "I was angry and I said something stupid." "I believe you didn't mean to send it to me," I said, "but you meant the words." Tears collected in her lashes. For a brief moment, I felt the old instinct to comfort her, the mother's reflex to smooth sorrow even when it isn't deserved, but I stayed still. Some distances shouldn't be closed once truth has drawn them. "You're choosing to misunderstand me," she said quietly. "No," I answered. "I'm choosing to hear you." That ended the conversation more cleanly than raised voices ever could have. Ellen stood slowly wiping her cheeks. She walked toward the hallway, shoulders bent, not from age, but from the collapse of assumptions she'd carried for too long. At the doorway, she paused. "So, this is final?" "Yes." She nodded once, as if committing the moment to memory. Then she left the room, her footsteps smaller than I had ever heard them. I remained in Thomas's chair, letting my breath settle, letting the quiet return. Outside, the light shifted across the garden. Inside, something in me finally settled into its rightful place. The legal documents arrived 2 days later, delivered by a courier who looked barely old enough to rent a car. He handed me the envelope with a polite smile, unaware of the shift it would cause inside the house. I signed for it, thanked him, and closed the door gently. There was no triumph in the moment, only a quiet confirmation of what already existed. Ellen and Gavin were in the kitchen when I walked in with the envelope. Gavin looked up, first suspicion already gathering across his features. Ellen's hands froze around her mug. "What's that?" she asked. "Your notice?" I said, simply placing the envelope on the table. "It explains the timeline and the terms." Gavin snatched it, tore the seal open, and stared at the first page. His jaw tightened. Ellen leaned over his shoulder, reading quickly. Her breath grew uneven. "You gave us 30 days, she said softly. 30. That is standard, I replied, and generous. Gavin let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "This is unbelievable. You can't just decide to evict us. You can't." "I can," I answered, "and I have." Ellen pressed her fingertips to her forehead, shaking her head. "Mom, we have lives here. Jobs, routines, commitments. You're asking us to uproot everything." "Nothing is being asked," I said. "It is being informed." Her voice trembled. "Where do you expect us to go? That is for you to decide." Gavin stepped toward me, not threatening, but towering in a way he hadn't before. "You realize how this looks. An elderly woman pushing out her own family. People will talk." I held his gaze. "Let them. They haven't lived in this house." He opened his mouth, closed it again, then looked at Ellen as though expecting her to rescue the conversation. She didn't. She sank into a chair, deflated. "What about your future, Mom?" she asked. "Who's going to take care of you if something happens?" "I will," I said, "the way I always have." "But what about us?" Her voice cracked. "Doesn't family matter to you at all?" "It matters enough," I replied, "that I refuse to keep pretending we are something we're not." Gavin muttered under his breath, pacing. "She's making a mistake. This is delusional." I watched him calm and unshaken. "You may call it whatever you like. The outcome remains the same." Ellen pushed the papers away and stood abruptly. She moved toward me and reached for my arm, not roughly, but with urgency. "Mom, please don't do this. We can change. We can do better." I placed my hand over hers, gently removing the grasp. If you had wanted to do better, you would have done it long before now. She swallowed hard. You're choosing to ruin our lives. No, I said, I'm choosing not to let you ruin mine. Her face crumpled. She looked at Gavin helplessly, as if expecting him to argue her back into safety. But he seemed suddenly older, tired out of rehearsed lines. We can fight this legally, he said quietly. You can try, I answered, but the house is mine. The law is not on your side. Silence settled again, heavier this time. Not the silence of waiting, but the silence of realizing the argument was over. Ellen wiped her eyes and whispered, I never thought you'd choose yourself over us. I looked at her steadily. I should have chosen myself years ago. She turned away, shoulders hunched, and Gavin followed her down the hall. Their footsteps sounded different now, less confident, more uncertain. The house felt larger in their absence, as if it finally recognized who it belonged to. I remained at the kitchen table, letting the documents rest beneath my fingertips. The moment didn't feel victorious. It felt necessary. For the first time in a long time, the house and my life were no longer slipping from my hands. They were returning to them. The day I decided to leave the house myself was quieter than I expected. Not dramatic, not heavy, just quiet. The way a long conversation ends when both people have finally said everything there is to say. Ellen and Gavin spent the morning moving through the rooms like unsettled ghosts, opening cupboards, closing them, whispering to each other in short, clipped bursts. I moved more slowly, taking in the house, not as a place of conflict, but as something I had tended for half a lifetime. In the afternoon, I walked into the main bedroom, Thomas's and mine, before Ellen claimed it for herself. The room smelled faintly of furniture polish, though I hadn't touched it in weeks. Light filtered through the curtains, the same way it always had, softening the edges of the dresser he built by hand. I stood there for a while, letting the memory of him settle around me. Not sorrowful, just steady. It reminded me of who I had been before the years grew heavy. I began packing only what was necessary. A few dresses, some sweaters, Thomas's watch, the recipe box, with Nora's handwriting tucked between my own cards, a framed photo of the three of us on the porch steps. I chose things that belonged to my life, not the life Ellen and Gavin had constructed around me. When Ellen saw the suitcase by my door, she froze. Mom, where are you going? To my new place, I said simply. She blinked quickly. You're moving out now before we go. Before all of this drags into something uglier than it needs to be, she stepped closer. But this is your home. You said so yourself. It is, I replied. Which is why I'm choosing the terms of how I leave it. Her face twisted in confusion, and something like fear. I understood that fear. Not of losing me, but of losing the version of me who had lived under their rules. Gavin appeared behind her, his expression pinched. Where exactly are you going? To a cottage near the coast, a quiet one. The paperwork was finalized this morning. I didn't tell them that the trust documents for the house had been filed at the same time. Ellen shook her head. This makes no sense. Why would you leave your own house because staying would keep us all trapped in the same pattern, I said. And I'm finished with patterns that erase me. For a moment, she just looked at me. Truly looked not as an inconvenience, not as a burden, but as someone she didn't recognize. It unsettled her. I could see it. I never wanted it to be like this, she whispered. I know, I said, but wanting and doing are not the same. I carried my suitcase to the front door. The weight of it was manageable, lighter than the years I was leaving behind. When I stepped outside, the cold air filled my lungs in a way that felt almost new. The taxi rolled up the driveway, the driver stepping out to help. Ellen reached for my arm, her grip hesitant. Mom, please don't go like this. I placed my hand gently over hers. This is the only way I can go with dignity. She let go slowly, as if realizing she no longer had the right to hold on. I turned back to the house once more. The porch steps Thomas built still held their familiar lines. The garden waited for spring. The windows reflected the pale winter light. It was still my home, just not the place for the rest of my life. The driver opened the door. I settled into the seat, the suitcase beside me. As we pulled away, Ellen and Gavin stood on the porch, not waving, not calling out, just watching, as though unsure whether the world could truly continue without me standing inside it. But the world did continue, and for the first time in years, I was finally choosing where mine would go. Life has a way of rearranging itself quickly, once truth finally takes its place. I settled into the small coastal cottage within a week. A modest one-story building with a narrow porch, a quiet street, and a view of the ocean if you leaned a bit toward the window on the east side. I didn't need much. Peace doesn't require square footage. It requires space of a different kind. The first morning there, I woke to the sound of gulls and the faint hum of the tide. No footsteps in the hallway, no thinly veiled sighs behind closed doors, no one asking where I was going or why. I made tea, opened the kitchen window, and let the salt air slip inside. It felt like the house inhaled with me. Meanwhile, Ellen and Gavin's unraveling began almost immediately. I didn't witness it, but I heard pieces of it through Nora, who visited me 2 days after I moved. She arrived on the little porch, holding a bag of groceries and a look of concern she tried to hide. "Grandma," she said softly after I let her in, "Mom is not doing well." I motioned for her to sit at the small table. "Tell me what's happening." She hesitated, choosing her words. They didn't take the news about the trust very gracefully. I nodded. I didn't expect them to. They thought they'd be able to argue it. She continued, "But the attorney made it clear. Your decision is final. The house is legally protected. They can't touch it." The kettle hissed softly in the background, a steady grounding sound. "And where are they now?" I asked. "In a rental across town," she said. "Small, expensive. They weren't prepared for the cost. I could almost picture it. Gavin pacing, Ellen rearranging things that didn't want to be rearranged. Both of them confused by a world that no longer bent around their conveniences. Nora pressed her hands together. "Mom keeps saying she never imagined you'd actually leave, that she misjudged you." "She didn't misjudge me," I said. "She simply never looked closely." Nora's eyes softened. "She's scared." "Grandma." She realized she depended on you more than she ever admitted. Dependence disguised as resentment. That was always the quiet thread between us. "And what about you?" I asked gently. She gave a small smile. "I'm relieved. I know that sounds awful, but I'm glad you're somewhere safe, somewhere respected." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Her fingers curled around mine with the same sincerity she'd had since she was a child, a sincerity Ellen once had before life hardened her edges. After she left, I stepped outside, letting the afternoon sun warm my back. The neighborhood was peaceful. A man walked his dog slowly down the street. A woman watered her plants on the porch next door. People here lived without urgency, without performance. That evening, as the sky shifted to gold, my phone rang. I didn't need to check the number to know who it was. Ellen's voice trembled when she spoke. "Mom, we got the formal trust notice today." "I know," I said. A long pause followed. Not angry this time, not defensive, just hollow. "You really meant it," she whispered. "Yes." Another pause. I could hear her swallow. "We're struggling. The rent is a lot. Gavin's upset. Everything feels heavy." "I'm sorry for the heaviness," I said, "but it isn't mine to carry anymore." She made a small, fragile sound. "I never thought you'd choose a life without us." I didn't choose a life without you, I answered softly. I chose a life without cruelty. Silence again, then very quietly. I don't know who I am without being annoyed at you. The honesty startled me. Not tenderness, but truth. Then perhaps I said gently, "You're finally in a place to learn." She didn't answer. She simply breathed shaky and uneven, as if adjusting to air she'd never had to inhale before. When the call ended, I stood by the window watching the last streaks of light fade over the water. Their lives were collapsing outward piece by piece. Mine, for the first time in years, was folding inward into something steady and private and completely my own. The days began to settle into a rhythm I hadn't known in years. Not exciting, not busy, just mine. At the cottage, mornings arrived gently with pale light stretching across the small wooden floor, and the sound of the ocean brushing against the shore, like a quiet reminder that the world could still be soft. I would sit at the little table with my tea, watching the steam rise, feeling no need to hurry. No one waited for me to clear the way. No one sighed in the next room. Silence had finally become a companion instead of a warning. I filled the time with simple things, rearranging the pantry, mending a loose button on a cardigan, walking slowly down the narrow road that curved along the water. Neighbors waved some, introduced themselves. A few noticed my age and leaned in as though expecting fragility to announce itself in my voice. But I have never been fragile. Tired, perhaps worn by years, but not breakable. One afternoon, I bought plants, small ones, rosemary, a pot of mint, a modest fern. I placed them on the windowsill where they caught the sun. It felt good to tend to something, again, something that asked nothing of me except a little water and attention. Thomas would have approved. He used to say that caring for small living things keeps a person steady. I rarely thought of the house now. It no longer pulled at my mind the way it once had. Letting go, I realized, is not the violent tearing people imagine. It's more like a quiet release, a door closing gently behind you when you finally understand you were never required to stay inside. Still, sometimes, I wondered if the roses in the back garden had bloomed early the way they used to. Not out of longing, but memory. Memory doesn't demand anything. It simply sits beside you. Ellen called once more that week. The conversation was brief. She told me they were managing, though I could hear the strain under her words. She kept her sentences short, as if afraid that anything longer might expose too much. She didn't ask to visit, and I didn't offer. It was the first time we had ever spoken without pretending closeness we didn't have. Oddly enough, that honesty made the call less painful. The person who did visit often was Nora. She came after her classes, bringing pastries from a bakery near campus and stories about her part-time job. She didn't speak about her parents unless I asked. And even then, she kept the details simple enough for me to understand the direction of their lives without being pulled back into the middle of them. One afternoon, she helped me hang a small framed photograph above the mantel. It was of Thomas and me, taken decades ago, our hands intertwined in that natural way. Long married couples hold each other without thinking. Nora stepped back and smiled. "It suits the place," she said. "It suits my life now," I replied. She grew quiet, studying me with those clear, steady eyes she inherited from her grandfather. "You seem lighter," she said softly. "I am." What changed? Nothing, I said, and then everything. She nodded, understanding more than Ellen ever had. There are children who inherit your habits and children who inherit your truth. Nora, thankfully, was the latter. When she left that evening, I walked her to the porch. The air had cooled, carrying a faint scent of seaweed and pine. She hugged me tightly, without pity, without worry, just warmth. When her car disappeared around the bend, I stayed outside for a while, watching the last traces of daylight slip beneath the horizon. Inside the cottage smelled faintly of rosemary. The quiet wrapped around me, not heavy, not echoing, but full. A life uncluttered, no longer squeezed into the corners of someone else's comfort. I sat in my chair, folded my hands, and breathed in the stillness. For the first time in decades, I wasn't bracing myself for anything. I was simply living. It was late afternoon when Nora called and asked if she could stop by. Her voice held a calmness I'd come to recognize. She never rushed me, never pushed. I told her of course she could. I put the kettle on and set out 2 cups, the good ones with the thin porcelain rims. I don't save nice things for occasions anymore. Life itself is the occasion. She arrived with her backpack slung over one shoulder and a soft smile on her face. "Grandma, the ocean smells stronger today," she said as she stepped inside. "You can feel the salt in the air. It means the wind is shifting," I replied. "It does that when seasons start to change." She sat across from me, folding her hands the way Thomas used to do when he was preparing to say something important. Her eyes wandered briefly over the room, the photograph above the mantel, the plants on the windowsill, the half-finished crossword on the table. She absorbed the place the way one absorbs a painting, noticing what is there and also what is no longer missing. "Mom wants to visit," she said finally, "but she doesn't know how to ask." I stirred honey into my tea. She knows how. She just doesn't want to risk hearing no. Nora nodded, the faintest crease forming between her brows. "She's different lately, smaller somehow. She doesn't talk as confidently as she used to." "Life humbles people," I said. "Some learn from it, some don't." "Do you want her to come?" Nora asked. I looked out the window where the pale winter sun lay across the porch. The question wasn't sharp. It was gentle, but it required honesty. "I don't want her to come out of guilt," I said, "and she isn't ready to come out of love." Nora considered that. "Would you ever forgive her?" Forgiveness is a word people use too quickly. They toss it like confetti at funerals and family gatherings, hoping it covers the truth beneath it. "Forgiveness isn't the issue," I said. "I don't hate her. I'm not angry. I'm simply finished." She nodded slowly. I could see she understood, not as a child trying to justify someone else, but as a woman beginning to understand the contours of dignity. After tea, she asked if we could walk to the shore. The air was colder than earlier in the week, the wind sweeping across the sand in long strokes. We walked slowly the way I always do, but she never hurried ahead. She kept pace with me naturally, as though we were partners in the same rhythm. "Grandma," she said after a while, "Mom keeps saying she doesn't know how to fix things." I felt the firmness of the ground beneath my feet. That's because she still thinks things can go back to what they were. "And can they?" Nora asked. "No," I said gently. "But something else could grow in the space that's left if she wants it. If she's willing to build something new, not drag the old shape into the light again." Nora let out a small breath that seemed half relief, half sadness. "She misses you," she said quietly, though she'd never say it aloud. "I know," I replied, "but missing someone doesn't undo the ways you've treated them. It only shows you what you lost." We reached a bench overlooking the water. The tide was low, the sea stretching out in long, even lines. We sat, letting the cold settle into our sleeves and the quiet settle into our bones. Nora rested her head lightly against my shoulder, the same way she had done when she was 6 and frightened of thunderstorms. "I'm glad you left," she whispered. "I know that sounds disloyal, but I'm glad." "It isn't disloyal to recognize peace," I said. "It's simply the truth." She straightened, brushing hair from her face. "And I want you to know I won't let you disappear. Not the way Mom let you fade into the background. I won't do that." I smiled at her, a small, steady thing. "You don't have to promise anything. Just live kindly. That's all I ever wanted for any of you." We sat a while longer listening to the tide. No grand declarations, no rebuilding of broken bridges, just a quiet moment between two women, one at the end of her long road, one still choosing hers. When we walked back to the cottage, the sky had shifted again, strewn with pale lavender and gold. Evening was coming, and for the first time in many years, I felt entirely ready for it. The last days of winter passed gently in the cottage, each one settling into the next, with a calm I'd never known in my old house. Peace, I discovered, doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in, quietly through the cracks left behind when noise and tension finally leave. Some mornings, I still woke expecting to hear footsteps in the hallway or the low hum of someone's irritation waiting for me in the kitchen. Habit is a stubborn thing, but then I would open my eyes and see only the soft light on the ceiling, the stillness of a room that held no expectations, and I would breathe easily again. One morning, I sat on the porch wrapped in my shawl, watching the tide push a thin line of foam onto the sand. My hands rested on my lap, warm beneath the wool. My body is slower these days, but slowness has its own strength. It teaches you to feel the weight of things, your choices, your history, your freedom. I thought of Ellen, not with resentment, not with longing, just with the clarity that comes when you finally stop negotiating with what cannot change. She had sent one more message the week before, a brief note saying she hoped I was well. No questions, no requests, no apologies, just a line floating in the space between us. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't need to. Some distances are better tended with quiet rather than eager hands. She and Gavin were still adjusting to their new life. Nora told me they had settled into a smaller rental, a place with thin walls and old carpet, but close enough to her mother's shop that Ellen could walk to work. The first month had been hard for them. Now they were learning to stand on their own feet. Feet they had ignored for years because they always believed mine would steady their world. Losing the house forced them to see themselves without the frame I had provided. It wasn't punishment. It was simply truth asserting itself. I sipped my tea and felt the warmth travel slowly through my chest. A gull swooped low over the shore, its wings catching the light as if dipped in silver. I closed my eyes and let the wind brush the side of my face. It reminded me of Thomas, not the way he looked, but the way he carried himself through life. Quiet, steady, unshaken by other people's hurry. For so many years after his death, I tried to be the glue that held everyone together. But people cannot be held together by one person's endurance. They must choose to hold on themselves. Ellen never learned that. I hope one day she will. Later that afternoon, Nora visited again, bringing fresh bread and a bouquet of small white flowers. She said reminded her of me. Not showy, but strong. We sat at the table spreading butter across warm slices. The air filled with the scent of rosemary from the windowsill. She told me about her classes, her internship plans, a new friend she wasn't sure was just a friend. I listened the way someone listens when she has nothing left to protect or repair fully, without fear of what comes next. Before she left, she glanced around the cottage. "It suits you, Grandma," she said. "You look like you finally have space to breathe." "I do," I replied, "and I intend to keep it that way." After she drove off, I stepped outside once again. The sun had dipped low, turning the sky a soft copper. I stood on the porch and watched the evening settle into itself. My hands rested on the railing. The wood felt warm despite the chill in the air. For the first time in decades, there was no part of my life I needed to brace myself against. No small anticipations of hurt, no silent compromises, only the quiet dignity of choosing my own company, my own home, my own peace. If there is a moral to all this, it is simple. You do not owe your life to people who make you disappear inside it. You do not owe your home, your spirit, or your silence to those who treat them carelessly. Dignity is not something given. It is something reclaimed. I stepped back inside the cottage, closed the door gently, and let the warmth greet me. My life at 80 had finally become my own. If this story touched you, share your thoughts. Your voice matters more than you think.